Today's video is sponsored by Aura.
Do things really exist? Or is the world we live in just a dream? Today we're centering our deep dive around the age-old philosophical question. If a tree falls in a forest and there is no one around, does it still make a sound? Let's dive in.
Having your data stolen can be a scary thing. Although it's not something most people are aware of, data breaches happen more often than you might think. In fact, this year alone has seen a number of high-profile data breaches, such as Dell and United Health. Most alarming, however, was a data breach at National Public Data just a few months ago. They suffered a data breach that compromised over 2.9 billion records used for background checks, including critical personal information such as full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and most importantly, social security numbers. What's worse is that it has been confirmed that information from this data breach has been released online. Thankfully, you don't have to be afraid of data breaches or stolen information. You can feel safe and secure with today's sponsor, Aura. Aura monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to alert you about potential identity theft. They also provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance in case the worst happens. Plus, Aura offers a variety of other features that keep you safe online, including real-time alerts for data breaches, a VPN for secure browsing, a password manager to help you create and store strong passwords, and more. I've personally been using Aura to keep my information safe, and I not only love how easy it is to set up, but I also really love their data broker removal tool. Data brokers collect and sell your information online, exposing you to spam, robocalls, and other unwanted advertising, like unwanted text messages. To protect your privacy, Aura sends requests to have you removed from these online databases. Aura is incredibly thorough at ensuring that every trace of your personal information is kept safe. Don't let your information go unprotected, and check out Aura in the link below, or visit aura.com/loveofit and get a 14-day free trial.
I wouldn't necessarily consider myself an amateur astronomer, but I love studying all things space. I remember scrolling through a space photo gallery a few years back when I came across a photo of Saturn's moon, Titan. In 2005, the Cassini-Huygens space mission, launched jointly by NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Italian Space Agency, landed on the surface of Titan. It was the first photo I had ever seen from the surface of another moon other than our own. Despite its low resolution and limited vantage point, the image stayed in my mind for weeks after coming across it. I imagined myself being on Titan as Huygens came parachuting down to the surface. How strange it would be to stand there and witness something that no one else had ever witnessed. I noticed the pebbles laid out across the ground and wondered how long they had been sitting there. Have they been sitting there for thousands of years? Or perhaps it had only been a few days since a strong gust of wind knocked them over to where they are now. Perhaps those rocks have been sitting there since the birth of Titan. It was a strange thing to me to think that millions of miles away, a few rocks are sitting on the ground, and we, humanity, have seen them for the very first time. I wonder if those rocks are still sitting exactly where they were when that photo was taken. Then it dawned on me. I wonder what other curious piles of pebbles are laying dormant on a planet somewhere that will never be photographed by human civilization. Perhaps at this very moment, a quake is toppling a cliff face on the side of a mountain on an unknown planet somewhere in another solar system. Yet, if no one will ever be there to see it or hear it, how would we know that it ever happened? Sure, we can find signs of evidence of such events, but if an asteroid hits a planet millions of light years away, and humanity will never see or even know of its existence, how could we know or even say that it happened? You've probably heard similar questions before. In fact, odds are you've heard that same question phrased like this. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around, does it make a sound? I still remember being asked that question for the first time as I sat in my Intro to Philosophy course in college. I had never considered it before. I had just assumed that what existed is what existed. I never considered that things wouldn't actually exist apart from some human observing it. So, does it make a sound? It does. Or maybe it doesn't. Philosophers and thinkers have been wrestling with this very question for thousands of years, all the way back to the time of two ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato. In fact, the centuries of debate on the topic can be divided into two schools of thought, those who thought like Aristotle and those who thought like Plato. Aristotle argued for the existence of the natural world, independently of whether or not we are here to observe it. Plato, on the contrary, believed that the material world is just a representation or a shadow of true existence. Today, we might refer to these schools of thought as realism, Aristotle's way of thinking, and idealism, Plato's way of thinking. James Ladyman, in his book, Understanding Philosophy of Science, defines realism as the view that we should believe in the unobservable objects postulated by our best scientific theories. In other words, realists make the same claims about those things we can't see as they do about those things that we can see. This means that, to one extent or another, realists believe in the existence of a world which exists independent of mine or anyone else's observation of it. Regardless of whether or not realists believe our experience of the world is mind independent, they are committed to the existence of theoretical unobservables, or things like protons and neutrinos, whose existence is only observable through data rather than direct observation. Realism can be categorized even further into two broad categories: direct realism and indirect realism. Direct realism teaches that the world outside of us is, in fact, directly correlated to the world I perceive in my mind. In other words, when I observe a tree falling in a forest, it does make a sound because the world outside of my mind is directly related to what my mind is perceiving. The problem, however, is that not all things are what they appear to be. And if we are to build a body of knowledge and understanding on our correlated perception of reality alone, we are sure to get some things wrong. For example, if I am observing a straw being placed in a glass cup, I might also observe that that same straw bends as it enters a cup filled with water. According to direct realism, the straw really is bending, and when taken out of the cup of water, the straw really is bending itself back. But we know that's not the case. In fact, the same argument can be applied to similar phenomena. It's the problem that indirect realism sought to answer. John Locke, an indirect realist and English philosopher writing in the 17th century, argued in favor of what he called representative realism. Locke argued that there are ideas or sensations in our minds and qualities or descriptions or attributes of a thing like an apple. The qualities of a thing produce the idea or sensation in my mind. So the quality of redness of a red delicious apple produces the idea of red in my mind as I perceive it. Locke might solve our dilemma, the dilemma of trees falling in forests, this way. Sound is a quality that our brains perceive. It is the result of airwaves created by pressure hitting our inner ears and being converted into electrochemical signals in the brain. Sound itself is not a thing which exists beyond our brain's ability to perceive and translate it. So, for Locke, the tree doesn't make a sound. All it does is create airwaves. In fact, even if there were people there to observe a tree falling in a forest, there would still be no sound in the forest. The sound is and always will be an idea or sensation created in the brain, not out there in the world. What does exist out there in the world are airwaves. Locke's view sounds appealing, and rightly so. It's a well-crafted framework from which to argue that there does exist something outside of our individual perception of things. However, challenges to Locke had arisen almost as quickly as his ideas had spread. One problem with Locke's view is with his idea of perception. Indirect realism posits that we only directly perceive sensations or ideas in our mind, rather than the external world itself. This raises issues about how we can be certain our mental representations accurately correspond to an external reality. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is the phenomenon of the dress. You've probably seen pictures of this dress before. Is it white and gold, or is it black and blue? I have no particular reason to believe that the idea in my head is indeed correctly correlated and caused by the object which exists in the external world. Furthermore, it's unclear how mental representations could reliably track and refer to an independent external reality, given the causal gap between the mind and the external world. Realism certainly has its challenges, but it's not the only framework from which we can begin solving our tree dilemma. Idealism, as opposed to realism, is a position with many possible sides. Some idealists merely reject the validity of scientific theories, and some reject the existence of a mind-independent reality altogether. In general, idealism rejects the existence of unobservables, such as photons or neutrinos. In contrast to realism, idealism argues that there essentially is no external world, and that what we perceive with our senses exists only in our minds. It adds meaning to the phrase, living in your own little world. George Berkeley, an Anglo-Irish philosopher writing in the 18th century, is perhaps one of the most well-known defenders of idealism. Berkeley believed that reality was merely a series of mental images or ideas. He referred to it as esse est percipi, or to be is to be perceived. All of reality for Berkeley was in the mind. Along with the arguments we've already raised against indirect realism, Berkeley had even more. The likeness principle states that an idea can be nothing but an idea. Essentially, we can only perceive our own ideas of reality, not the raw, unfiltered perception of reality itself. Furthermore, if we can only ever perceive our own ideas of reality, then none of our perceptions of reality are ever anything but our own ideas. If true, then there is no basis for arguing that our ideas can derive from an external world. Berkeley's ideas were in direct conflict with Locke's ideas. Yet, just like Locke, Berkeley's ideas weren't without their weaknesses. Despite his reasoning seeming that there is no external world, Berkeley's ideas feel uncomfortable to us because they go directly against our common sense reasoning about the world around us. Common sense tells us that a world does exist, which is independent and external to us. When I return to my home after being away for several hours, my living room looks exactly as I had left it. Yet, how can this be if there is no external world? How can my living room be continuous in the way it looks if there is nothing external to me to ground it in reality? How can my perceptions of the world in which I live in daily be consistent if there is nothing giving them consistency? Berkeley's solution would take itself outside of our minds entirely. To sum up his solution, let's consider once again a tree that falls in a forest with no one around. Does it make a sound? Despite his staunch defense of idealism, Berkeley would argue that it does. Why is that? Because, for Berkeley, all things have continued existence. Not because they're being perceived by me or any other person, Rather, because they're being perceived by someone who is able to perceive all things at all times. God. There are many ideas of who or what God is. For Berkeley, it is the God of the Bible, who created and sustains all things. Genesis 1:31 tells us that God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. God sees all things because he knows all things. Psalm 147 tells us that he counts the stars and knows each and every one of them by name. Our Lord is great and powerful. There is no limit to what he knows. Perhaps Berkeley was right, and there is indeed an asteroid falling through the sky on a planet somewhere that will never be known or observed by the human race. Every tree, no matter where it is, truly does make a sound when it falls. There is a sense of peace that comes from Berkeley's words, a peace in the knowledge that all things are known. No matter what mysteries of the universe evade us or catastrophic calamities lie waiting in the shadows, there is not a single thing that is unknown to God. At the same time he knows that there is a gust of wind on Venus toppling a boulder from the edge of a canyon, he also knows what you and I ate for breakfast this morning. Regardless of whether or not the world we live in is real or an idea, it is undeniably beautiful, down to the very last pebble. So maybe a tree falling in a forest really does make a sound after all.